Alright, in today's video we're going to talk a little bit about major scales, but before we do that, let's review our whole steps and our half steps. Remember that half steps are the smallest space in between two notes in Western music. So the half step, if we're looking at our keyboard, is from one white key to a black key, or from one black key to a white key, or from one white key to a white key, without skipping anything. So no skips involved in a half step. In a whole step, we combine two half steps. So if we start with this white key, we go white to black, it's a half step, black to white, that's a half step. That makes a whole step. This would not be a whole step between these two white keys right here because there's no black key in between. You have to have two half steps to make up a whole step. And we talked about sharps and flats last time. So just real quick to refresh our memory. A sharp makes the sound go up a half step. There's the original pitch. There's the sharp. Okay. A flat makes the pitch go down a half step, and it looks like a B. So there's the original pitch. There's the flat. There you go. So that's the difference between half steps and whole steps, both on a keyboard and in written notation. So when we talk about scales, scales are a pattern. They are a pattern of whole steps and half steps in between each note. And the pattern is whole step, half step, whole step, half step, as you see here on the screen. So we have the space in between the first two notes is a whole step. Space in between the next two notes, a whole step. Space in between. And each one of these is measuring the space from the lower note to the higher note. Is the half step, then whole, half. Okay? Here's what it looks like if you were to start on B flat. This is a B flat in the treble clef. B flat to C is a whole step. C to D is another whole step. Okay? D to E would be a whole step. There'd need no black key in between. So it's very important that we add a flat. So it becomes D to E flat. That gets us our half step. Then E flat to F gives us our whole step, because E flat, if we go back and look at our whole steps and half steps, E and F, E is right here, F's right there. There's no black key in between. Now, I wish I could tell you there was a really cool way to remember this, but there's not. Okay? I encourage you, and I'll try to link one in the comments, to download an image that just lists out the letter names that go with the keyboard for this concept, because it will certainly help you to be able to identify these half steps and whole steps faster, especially if you've already committed the lines and spaces in treble and bass clef to memory. So E to F, since it's E flat, that now gives us a whole step. So E flat to F, remember flats lower it by a half step. Then we have F to G, another whole step. G to A, another whole step, and then A to B flat, another half step. Nice thing about major scales is that the last note is always going to be the same letter name as the first note, whatever it is. So if we have a B flat as our first note, the 8th note has to be a B flat. So let's keep going. What if we started here and we started on this E flat? Okay? E flat to F is a whole step, because remember there's a space in between, there's no key in between E and F on the keyboard. Then F to G is a whole step, so we have whole step, then we have to have G to what to make this a half step? Do we add a sharp, which will make it go higher, and that will make the space between G and A bigger, or do we add a flat, which will make the space between G and A smaller? Are we trying to get a half step, a whole step, or more than a whole step out of it? Adding that flat gives us the half step we need. G to A would be a whole step. There would be a black key in between. So we have to lower it by a half step, and that's our flat symbol. So we have whole step, E flat to F, whole step, F to G, half step, G to A flat. Now we need a whole step, A flat to B. Is that right? Is A to B on our keyboard, is A to B a whole step? And are we starting on A? Or are we starting on A flat? So if we're starting on A flat, which we are, then what's one whole step higher? Is it all the way up here to B? Is it right here to A flat to A? Or are we going from A flat to B flat? That's right, we need to add a flat. Then B flat to C is a whole step, C to D is a whole step, and because we always end on the same letter that we started on in a major scale, we put that flat there. And this gives us our major scale, and both of these will sound the same. Now that sounded weird because we didn't actually have the flats in. So let's go ahead and make those flats official and listen to it again. See, that's so much better. Now if I start here, it ends up being the same kind of sound because it's the same pattern. Now so many people have been exposed either in their school or through movies like The Sound of Music or through watching American Idol even to the idea of a major scale, because major scales are kind of the building blocks of all musical composition. There's so many rules later on that are based off of this. One of the other ways to think about this is in solfege. So when we're thinking solfege, there's a couple of different systems, but the system I'm going to use is going to be movable do. And what this means is that the first note of a major scale is always called do. So that would be this E flat or this B flat. Doesn't matter what the letter name of it is. For the purposes of what we're going to talk about when we talk about solfege, the first letter of the scale, the first note of the scale, is going to be do. So do, re, mi. See if you can finish it out. And then of course do, because it's the same letter name, B flat and B flat. If I were to write another C up here, what solfege syllable would we say for that? Would we say mi, la, sol? If you were thinking through in your pattern, you're going to think do, re. Now, I'll be honest, there's a lot of really cool stuff that can be done if you understand solfege a little better. This video is not the one where we're going to really talk much about it, and we may only talk about it here and there as a reference point. Another way to think about this are with numbers. So when we have our first note of the scale, that can be referenced as 1, then 2, and we know from our intervals that what interval is this from the first note of the scale to the second note of the scale. From one note to the note right above it. It's a second. And this is where we get those intervals from. Those intervals tie into what goes on in a major scale. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and the 8th note is repeated. That's called an octave. The interval between the first note and the last note of a major scale, 8 notes apart, is the octave. Okay? Now these intervals we're going to talk a lot about in the next video, even in more depth, because we know about our thirds, where we go from, for instance, line to line, or space to space the next up. We know about our fourths. When we go 4 notes up, we start maybe on B flat and go to the 4th note, E flat. Or our fifths, where we start on B flat and go to the 5th note, F. Okay? And those are generic terms for intervals. But how could the half steps, the flats and sharps, mess that up? What if, for instance, what if we took away one of our notes here? What if we changed that and took the flat away? It's no longer exactly 8 notes apart. And now the interval is changed. So the best way to think about this is to do it from scratch. So if we're thinking about our intervals, and let's say we're going to think about our thirds. And we remember these from previous examples. F-A, F-A. Okay, that is a third apart. It goes from space to space, from the first note to the third note. But if I lower it, it no longer sounds the same. And that gets into how we get to different kinds of scales. So the important thing to remember for right now is that our scales end up being evenly spaced in a pattern. So let's think, for instance, about doing one in the bass clef. Let's do a different one. Let's start on F. So if I just go ahead and put notes right up the staff, that doesn't fit the pattern naturally. And listen to it and hear the difference between the major scale so that major scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, that we're used to, and what we have right now. Could you spot which notes or the notes that need to be changed just by listening to it? Listen to it again and see if you can hear the ones that don't sound the same. So here's our example. And I encourage you to even try maybe to sing that. Let's do one slower. Let's see if you can sing it with it. Because the better you can get at hearing this as we go over it, the easier it's going to be to do more complicated things later on. Now, listen to the uncorrected scale. Could you hear the most obvious note? The one that just really didn't sound right? And if you couldn't, that's okay, but think it through with your half steps and whole steps. So if we were going to make an adjustment, we have F to G, and remember we're in bass clef, which changes the letters. F to G, then is that a whole step or a half step? And if you need to refer to your keyboard cheat sheet, I encourage you to do that. Then G to A, whole step or half step. You remember from what we talked about earlier. So we have to have a whole step, which we do, then another whole step in between, which we do. Now A to B, is that a whole step, or is there an ability to put a flat in there on the higher note? That's right, you can add a flat, which raises or lowers the sound. Lowers it. So now we have a half step. F to G, whole step. G to A, whole step. A to B flat, half step. Now B flat to C, is it a whole step or a half step? That's right, because it's one of the exceptions where there is no black key in between. So B flat to C is a whole step, which is good because we have whole, whole, half, and the next one has to be whole. And we have to have another whole step, C to D, which we're covered. Then another whole step, D to E. Now, do we need to adjust anything here? D to E is a whole step, so it fits the pattern. But what about E to F? What do we know about the 8th note of the scale always? That's right, it's going to be the same letter name, whatever it is the first note. So let's listen to that and see if just that one change made things sound better. So those are major scales. Now, they don't have to just go up. They can obviously go back down as well. When they do, you just do the notes in reverse order. Oh, ran out of space. And so now we have a scale that goes up and down. It's the space in between notes that matters, not which direction we're going. And the more familiar you can get with understanding how the major scale is put together and what it sounds like, the easier the other steps are going to be. Remember, music is a sequential sort of thing, especially reading notation. So the more familiar you get with each element that we go over, and the easier it is for you to identify it, the easier you will be to accommodate the further and new information. So if you're still struggling with identifying letter names in both class, it's going to start bogging you down as you watch the video. So make sure that you know the letter names and you have them to memory so that you can follow along.